Welcome everyone to the Heritage Lecture Series on Dharmanomics conducted by IIT Hyderabad in collaboration with Bṛhat. Before we begin and before we introduce the speaker to you, I would like to begin this session on an auspicious note with the 32 names of Ma Durga. So I would request everyone to close their eyes so that we can begin with the 32 names of Ma Durga. दुर्गा दुर्गार्ति शमनी दुर्गा पद्मिनी वारिणी दुर्गमच्छेदिनी दुर्गा साधिनी दुर्गा नाशिनी दुर्गतोद्धारिणी दुर्गा निहंत्री दुर्गमा पहा दुर्गमा ज्ञानदा दुर्गा दैत्यलोकद वानला दुर्गमा दुर्गमा लोका दुर्गमात्मस्वरूपिणी दुर्गमार्गप्रदा दुर्गम विद्या दुर्गमाश्रिता दुर्गमज्ञान संस्थाना दुर्गमध्यान भाषिणी दुर्गमोहा दुर्गमगा दुर्गमार्थस्वरूपिणी दुर्गमासुर संहंत्री दुर्गमायुद्धधारिणी दुर्गमांगी दुर्गमता दुर्गम्या दुर्गमेश्वरी दुर्गभीमा दुर्गभामा दुर्गभा दुर्गदारिणी. Welcome everyone again to this lecture series on Dharmanomics. Before I hand it over to Amritji to introduce the speaker to you, I would just like to add a few lines on the book since I had the opportunity to read and review it. In Dharmanomics, Sriram Balasubramanian ji talks about how dharma impacts artha and how it has had impacted artha in Bharata in a continuity of over 5,000 years, from Saraswati Sindhu Valley civilization to Vijayanagara Empire and even beyond. And he looks at how the various layers of dharma, at one layer the temple, at one layer the mercantile community, the śreṇis have their own dharma, and how they all function within the ambit of what we know as dharma, the principle of contentment, to gain prosperity for not only their kings, not only their country, but themselves as well, while fulfilling their zeal of economic expansion and dharmic capitalism, so to say, without surrendering to wanton consumerism. It's a great book, and I would request everyone to read it. And now I would like to request Amritji to introduce the speaker, introduce Bṛhat to the participants, and then we'll take it forward from there.
Thank you, Anshuman. Namaste, everyone. Namaste, Sriramji. Very glad to have you here. So Sriramji, he's a leading thinker in economics, macroeconomics. He has worked with organizations such as the International Monetary Fund. He writes extensively on a lot of different socio-economic trends, and particularly to our concern today, and the book that we'll be discussing, what we can talk about as dharmic capitalism. So what has India's modes of economy, of commerce, of profit building been, and the distribution of wealth been in ancient India using śreṇis, which has been our commercial guilds, and temple economies. He has written about that also in his book Kautilyanomics, which came out previously, which delves deeper into Arthashastra and how Arthashastra is embedded in the Indian society. And now Anshuman also told us about Dharmanomics, which we will discuss today. So with that, over to you, Sriramji. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste, everyone. It's an honor to be part of this discussion. First of all, I want to thank Raghav for inviting me. I really wish I was, I could make it to Hyderabad, but because of the weather and a variety of other factors, even though I sort of tried my best, it wasn't possible. But Raghav has been very kind and, has sort of always engaged with me over a few years. So I'm grateful for that. So next time, this will be one of my first visits. So that's for sure, so that we don't have this issue. And thank you for the kind, introduction. I would like to sort of, given the audience and, given young researchers such as yours who are listening to this, I would sort of give a brief overview of not just my books, but where some of my research has taken me. Because most research ideas emanate from a thought process, from some questions that people have. And these research questions sort of trigger, a more detailed analysis, and that triggers research, and that produces books and things like that. So as you mentioned, I think one of the areas, while as a macroeconomist, my role is to, or my work is to analyze how the macroeconomy functions in many spheres. This includes, country-wide economics, what the country does, what the region does, and things like that, right? So in the process of my research, I think I chanced upon some work on the ancient Indian economic history, or ancient global history, and that relates to late Angus Madison's research work. And basically, what the primary argument is that Bharat was one of the top countries in GDP per capita during the Common Era period. Not only that, having born in Chennai and coming from Tamil Nadu, I see this visibly, especially with the grand temples that have been built in the state, which are such marvels that even today it is very difficult to replicate. So in that sense, I was always curious to understand, what was, the thinking behind this. And this also mapped out my first research question, which was basically, what is the indigenous Bharatiya economic model? It's a very, simple question, but the answers were quite difficult to get because, much of our discussion on economics has been somehow sort of morphed with politics. Where political movements, for example, related to the independence have been sort of morphed onto economics. So, but if you really think about it, this question, I think deserved a lot of answers. So I did a lot of, work on trying to understand this question. And that's where I chanced upon the Arthashastra, which is basically, for those who are not aware, it's a 3rd century BC text written by Kautilya or Chanakya. Which basically details or provides a template for a variety of ideas on the how to deal with artha as a concept, and how to deal with economic policy. Much of the discussion on the Arthashastra is a political discussion, but there's a reason why it's called the Arthashastra. So I made an attempt to, over a period of 4 or 5 years to look at the text, work with some scholars, and try to engage and understand the ideas in the text, and derive a framework. Because in most of these, ancient Bharatiya texts, they're all, prescriptive in nature, in the sense that, you have a text, and the text sort of gives you the output. Whereas what I was looking for is the input. How was the framework derived to get this out? So, one has to sort of go backwards and go into Kautilya's mind, for example, to derive this framework. So I think one of the important ways to do that is to look at thematic, consistencies across the text. And that led to that, took us quite a bit of time to derive this framework. So this is what I call dharmic capitalism. In the sense, dharma is a very, multi-dimensional word. For the narrow prism of economic policy, I define it through the sphere of ethics, responsibilities, and harmony, which is harmony basically meaning social harmony as well as harmony with the rest of the world. So these 3 definitions of dharma get mapped on to the role of a state which is strong but doesn't micromanage. It goes into wealth creation via global outlook and sustainable growth and welfare. These are 3 outputs sustainability and things like that. So that was the first part of the trilogy. So the second book, which we are, sort of talking about now, is an extension of that. So again, back to the research question again, in terms of understanding the indigenous model, I found that a lot of, common era kingdoms, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Kambojidesa and Cambodia, and all these kingdoms, and Southeast Asian kingdoms, had similar dharma-based economic frameworks, where the role of dharma was sort of central to their functioning, to their economic functioning. And I noticed that there are various iterations of this. In the sense, it was not a monotonous, homogeneous sort of entity, but it had various iterations. And through this book, I try to showcase that through a historical lens as well as a practical lens. So, for example, I introduce three major pillars. The first pillar is what I define as Kautilyan dharmic capitalism, which is what I mentioned to you, some time back. You notice that there are a lot of inscriptions or mentions of the Arthashastra in a lot of these places, including in Cambodia and Vietnam, where there are inscriptions which talk about, references to the Arthashastra. It's also important to note that, the entire background to the Arthashastra, in the sense that it was discovered only in, say, early 1915 in Bṛhat, based on which Shama Sastri made his first translation of the Arthashastra. So it was supposed to be not discovered anywhere. I mean, it was supposed to be lost, all this time. But the mysterious question is, how did it land in inscriptions in as far away as Cambodia and Vietnam, right? So I think, it could have been word of mouth, which is quite but the word of mouth has been strong enough for them to inscribe it and use it as part of their governance structures. So that was a very fascinating thing, right? Or the original text could have been in these places. That I'm not sure. But broadly speaking, the Kautilyan dharmic capitalism sort of structure was also there in some of these kingdoms, and in the sense they inspired from the Arthashastra. So this is one sort of pillar of my book, which some of you would have read. The second pillar is again related to what I call the dharmic ecosystem. I think this is an important deliberation or important intervention, because it talks about the temple-based economies. Often the temple, is considered a social, religious institution, and rightfully so, because that's its primary purpose. The samskaras and the ritualistic connotations of the temple and the maintenance of the temple and the agamas, in some cases of the temples, and all these things are, primary to the temple's existence. But the temple served a multi-dimensional purpose, especially in common era kingdoms and even today as well. So, for example, the temple as an economic institution is a very interesting proposition, because it served four main purposes. So, first, for example, it dealt with the issue of labor. I talk about labor aggregator. It provided employment to large sections of people in some of these kingdoms. Second, it served as an important financial institution. There is a reason why, if you notice, most of the temples, are within an hour's drive, hour and a half drive, major temples from the coastline of Bṛhat. So if you take Somnath, if you take, Padmanabha Swami temple in Kerala, if you take the Jagannath Puri temple, for example, in Odisha, many of these temples were reasonably close to the coast. And I think that's an important observation, because the temple served as financial institution as well. They were providing loans to businesses and śreṇis, which are the corporate guilds, which I'll come to next. And they were providing them at some amount of interest rate, which was, the earnings were used to maintain the temple and other assets of the temple. So it served as an important financial institution, which was both a bank as well as sort of a venture capital fund, which provided inputs to local entrepreneurs in terms of credit and financing. So that's a very, that's a very important role of the temple. So the third or the next major role of the temple is the fact that it was a redistributive center, right? What I mean by redistribution is, one of the common themes in economics is inequality, right? Which is basically the gap between the rich and the poor. How much there is a gap, and that is broadly defined as what, say, in very simple terms, what inequality is. So in the temples used to serve as as institutions that helped reduce this. So, for example, in the Vijayanagar Empire, you notice this, especially in the Tirumala temple plates. You notice that the Vijayanagar kings had institutionalized this to a large extent, where local rich people, say in a particular area, would contribute to an endowment fund. And this endowment fund would sort of finance the temple and finance the temple as an institution. And the temple used to provide 3 days, 3 times a day, free food to all the sort of poor people, below poverty line people in that area. So in a sense, it meant that the real poor people were at least fed quality, high nutrition food for every day, free of cost. And much of this was done by the investment made by the rich in the community, with the state playing a role of a regulator, ensuring that this process happens at a regular intervals. So what I'm trying to say is the temple as a redistributive, entity is also a very important sort of economic a role that a temple played. And then, of course, the ecosystem, that because the presence of a huge temple creates an ecosystem around that village in that particular area. For example, in today's Tamil Nadu or any other major village in India, in Bṛhat, you would notice that there's one major temple which has played an important role, and then there are a plethora of smaller temples. But if there is one single economic institution which drives the local economy, it's probably this big temple that is there in most of these villages. And they serve, and because of the fact that when I mean the ecosystem, what I'm meaning is the shops that that come around because of the temple, the tourism that comes in because of the temple, the entire sort of hospitality sector, the services sector that develops because of the temple, right? And also because in a sense, it's interesting to note is that the temple provides something what I call inelastic demand, which is basically continuous demand, irrespective of how, say, the macroeconomy functions, right? So, for example, if, say, the Reserve Bank of India decides to say hike interest rates, by 3 or 4 basis points, okay, or reduces interest rates by a few points, it doesn't make any difference to how we visit our temples. I mean, irrespective of what the external environment is, we still, because of faith and other purposes, we go to the temple as an institution and we get darshan and seva and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is the economy is created because of the temple as an institution, especially in villages. Not only does it decentralizes economic activity, it also ensures that economies of scale are built which are independent of macro factors. So you have a high amount of inelastic demand in these areas, which can be really expanded for economic opportunities. So coming back to this, so in common era kingdoms, you notice that a lot of these kingdoms have this diverse set of using temple as an economic institution. In Cambodia and Vietnam, for example, it was central to their economic policy, especially between 6th century CE and about 13th century CE, where because of the fact that Cambodia was landlocked compared to other countries, and this served an important role, both driving the rural economy as well as the urban economy as well. Whereas in the Cholas and you would notice this to be an important role. Of course, the Brihadishwara temple was built by the Cholas, but they also had other factors. I mean, they had trade, they had manufacturing, they had the śreṇis who also played a very important role. So it, and then in some kingdoms, the role of a temple was was there, but it served one of the multidimensional purposes that I mentioned. So what I'm trying to say is there are various iterations among these kingdoms, but the role of this dharmic ecosystem is a common theme that you see across. So that was the second sort of pillar. The third pillar is what I define as the śreṇi dharma. The śreṇi has played again a very crucial role. For those who really want to understand about śreṇis, besides reading my book, I suggest reading Professor Vikramaditya Khanna's paper on śreṇis. He's a professor at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He had produced a paper in early 2008 at Harvard. This is a very, very interesting paper on śreṇis. And I sort of work with Dr. Khanna, so I know the quality of that content. So that's for further research. But what I showcase here is these śreṇis were sort of multinational corporations. They were a combination of, say, multinational corporations and FICCI and CII combined together. So they basically were financing a lot of these kingdoms. They were organizations which were democratically elected. These guilds were, they had members who were very egalitarian across caste, creed, gender, and more importantly, even nationality. You had Jews as part of some of these śreṇis because they were trading in Bṛhat during that time. And these śreṇis, democratically elected their own leaders, and some of them were really huge. And they played a very important role in the socio-economic dynamic of a lot of these kingdoms. So, for example, this major śreṇi called Ainurvar, in Tamil it's called 500, was started in Karnataka by a bunch of Karnataka Brahmins who were traders as well, and really expanded in all the southern empires, so much so that they had offices in Southeast Asia, in Sumatra, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, and even in Cambodia as well. Much like how your multinational corporations today have, entities and offices. They had such a big influence on the Cholas, so much so that when Rajendra Chola conquered, Rajendra Chola is basically the son of Rajaraja Chola. Rajaraja Chola is the person who built the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur. His son was supposed to be, all-conquering leader or king who conquered both northern India as well as Southeast Asia. One of the reasons why he conquered Southeast Asia is this guild which I mentioned, Ainurvar, was trading on the Straits of Malacca, and which is basically contemporary Singapore today, via Singapore and then into China. So that was a trading route which they were taking. What had happened was that the king in Sumatra at that time, which is today Indonesia, was a Srivijaya kingdom. They stifled the śreṇis and did not allow them to function properly. And hence this blocked or this hindered trade and commerce. And because of the fact that, they were so powerful and they were financing the Cholas were, in a sense, one of the reasons for his conquest, for Rajendra Chola's conquest, was to ensure that the śreṇis were liberated. So along with the Cambodian king, they went on this, voyage to fight and liberate from the Srivijaya kingdom, which is what happened. And that's why you notice that, the Cholas, even though they conquered or they won these battles, they did not rule these places. You don't find the Chola kings ruling these entities because their main purpose, one of their main purpose was to ensure that commerce was going through, and that wasn't hindered, which was taken care of. So what I'm trying to say is there was a lot of political maneuvering, diplomacy, and the role of economics and maritime trade in all of this. And all this happened during the Common Era period. And the śreṇis played a very important role. An important, contribution or important point to note is that most of these śreṇis were governed by dharmic principles. So, for example, the Ainurvar guild itself were ruled by this idea of Binanjaya Dharma, which is a set of dharmic principles that they followed. So each of them had their various iterations or various definitions of dharma, for example, and each of them had various interpretations and inspirations of it. But these guilds were all governed by these principles, some of these principles. So and these principles were the foundation of their guilds. And it's important to note here because these guilds really have been perhaps the longest serving economic institution, even from the Saraswati service into civilization phase. There is also evidence, which I show in the book, that even in the SS phase, based on some interpretations of the interscript, which of course there are varied interpretations, let's not go there, but there is evidence to suggest some of these guilds even existed then. So how can an institution exist for such a long period of time, right? Without, and with leadership, all the kings were changing constantly, each of them were fighting with each other. But somehow the economic prosperity and somehow the guilds were functioning, in a reasonably good way. So my view or my assessment is that there had to be an underpinning of some socio-economic principle based on which their organization was set. And I argue that this is based on the idea of dharma and various iterations of dharma. And that's why you see an eternal prosperity in in these kingdoms, and the śreṇis as well. So the śreṇi and the śreṇi dharma is another third pillar of this book. And then, of course, I provide a lot of anecdotes, in the book of how, much of this, trade and much of the, conquest of some of these kings across lands was actually driven by common people. Common people were far ahead of their kingdoms. Most of the common people were trading extensively with other countries. For example, the second highest deposit of Roman coins in early Common Era is found in southern India after Europe. Similarly, if you look at a lot of the anecdotal evidences, it tells you that this was a land of immense prosperity, and the diverse set of products that were traded makes you get some perspective of how manufacturing and manufacturing at scale was happening during this time. So you had products like spices, you had products like manufacturing like tin and a lot of materials which were traded, and most of them were all traded at scale, which means they had institutions which were developing this at scale, and they were being exported to the rest of the world. So much so that the Roman current account deficit was impacted by a lot of the trade that was happening with Bṛhat. So what I'm trying to say is that, through these guilds, I mean, they are sort of eternal, I would say, glory or their resilience or sustainability is a fascinating subject by itself. And I think the dharmic principles which underpin their governance. I mean, we talk about democracy as somehow a post-French Revolution phenomenon, which is again, such a narrow Anglo-Saxon view. Because if we really notice, the Uttarameru inscriptions, I talk about them even in this book, they talk about how the political leaders at the Gram Panchayat level were elected through a democratic system. I'm talking about this inscription, which is about 9th century CE, for example, right? Similarly, the guilds, the śreṇis, for many thousand years were all, had a democratic process to elect their leaders. So much so that they were quite independent from the state. I think it's a very important point. We often think that a lot of the monarchy and monarchs have complete control over, whatever that they do. And that was not the case. The monarchs had land, they had some level of power, of course, compared to a common man. But they were more of a supervisory figure in a lot of these deliberations, especially with the śreṇis, where the state, if they nominated someone to head the śreṇi, but the śreṇi themselves don't have do not agree with it, then the śreṇis overruled even the king at times. So they had a lot of independence away from the state. And except for some basic regulation and rule of law and order, they had a lot of independence. And they were really big entities. I mean, similar to in scale to, say, the big multinational corporations, the Microsofts and the Apples of the world today. But they didn't have or they were sort of tempered by their dharmic principles, not to go in the political sphere or not to go on an overreach. And I think that the role of dharma played an important sort of role there. So these three, pillars, along with a variety of examples I show in the book, I provide a perspective of how a lot of these kingdoms had, these frameworks which were underpinning their prosperity. And what were some of the iterations, right? So each of them had their nuance, each of them had their different inspirations, different perspectives. So this is what I try to sort of bring about in this book. I read the review by one of your colleagues at Bṛhat, and I'm glad that it's resonating with a lot of you. But the primary goal is that this entire idea of dharma-based economic frameworks is not it's not some theory that one has thought about and then supposes it on the evidence. Rather, it's the other way around. The evidence clearly argues that there were frameworks like this, and these were sort of underpinnings, which is what I try to showcase in these books. And I use an important concept of what I define as triangulation of evidence. I think a lot of researchers or to-be researchers would want to listen to this because most of these ancient texts, the data is fairly limited. You don't get too much concrete data. And what happens is that, and even if you get data, it's not necessarily, I would say, robust enough data. Even the medicine data, for example, I think it's very good to look at the trend lines, what the broad trends say in the medicine data. But the aggregate numbers, again, are a bit suspect. For example, if you take a lot of the wealth in these temples, they're far higher than GDP of some of the countries today. Though wealth is a stock, I think it's also an important question to understand what is the role that some of these institutions played in the day-to-day economic governance as well. So what I'm trying to say is the data, in very simple terms, is not always the end all of the story. So one element of this triangulation is research based on data. The second element is what I call secondary research, which means inscriptions, dealing with a variety of inscriptions in all these places, and getting thematic understanding these inscriptions. I think that's very important because most of the inscriptions are very prescriptive. They'll tell you, for example, the Cholas went and gave this much gold to this person at this point of time, and they will say at this interest rate, for example. But it's important for researchers to sort of look at this from a bigger picture and then draw thematic lessons from it. And these thematic lessons provide an important variable, in the entire discourse. So I think it's very important to look at the secondary research. The third part of it is what I define as anecdotal research, which is basically travelogues from travelers who were traveling during that time. These are all sort of third-party people who are listening into the conversation that was happening at that point of time in these conglomerate kingdoms, and they sort of observe and have records which illustrate that. So this again provides a sort of an independent perspective of what is happening during that time. So you have the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, for example. You have Chinese embassy notes. You have Roman embassy notes, Greek embassy notes, Greek travelers, for example. All of that sort of evidence is what I define as anecdotal evidence. So when you do a triangulation of this evidence, where you have a particular concept, that concept is referred in all these three, evidences, and both of them triangulate each other. All three of them triangulate each other, which either they support each other or they provide an additional perspective on the same idea with each other. Then we are having a far more coherent, rigorous, analysis. And that's how I think a lot of this work has been done in my case. And I think that's a fair sort of observation to do as well. I mean, fair way of dealing with this analysis. So lastly, I would like to, also, go back to what I mentioned earlier. So I mentioned two research questions. I dealt with one of them. The second one is something contemporary, but I think it's important. So most of the questions that people would have is, how is it relevant today? So the second research question would add, would provide some perspective on this. So the second research question is, how does sort of culture, norms, and narratives, play a role in economic policy and economic decision making, both at the individual sort of level and at the, say, corporate level, firm level, right? Most of our, if you notice, our discretionary spending, which is a non-essential spending, are all driven largely by our cultural norms, especially in Bharat. For example, the largest amount of UPI transactions in the last year was during the week of Diwali. Most of our discretionary expenditure is somehow linked to cultural norms and narratives in a very direct way. So that also alludes to economic choices, like how we buy products, how we buy goods. And if you really speak to folks in the advertising industry, they would tell you that this is far different from any other country because it's very attuned to their cultural norms. So that's a very important individual, trend that one needs to be cognizant about. And this is also there in corporates, because if you take the top 15, 20 corporates in this country, most of them are family-driven enterprises. And most of these family-driven enterprises, even though they're publicly listed, make economic choices based on their own cultural norms and narratives. So what I'm trying to say is their business decision-making is highly driven by these norms. So even today, these cultural norms and narratives play a very important role. A lot of research has been done in the West with regard to this. George Akelroth, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics in 2001 for asymmetric information, his work on identity economics talks a lot about norms and narratives. Similarly, Abner Gree from Stanford, even Gary Becker in an earlier avatar spoke about this in the context of the United States. What I'm trying to say is a lot of researchers from the West who have done this. But unfortunately, in Bharat, where this is central much more than anywhere in the world, we haven't really, gone deep into the subject. So this culture and this way of life that I'm talking about is, again, not an abstract concept that just came out of thin air post-independence. This is something which has been there for thousands of years. The entire sort of dharma-based economic frameworks is a representation of this dharmic way of life, of whose manifestation in today's form is what we are today, in my view. So the linkages to this past is very important, because the way of life has emanated from this past. And most of our economic choices today that we make is a consequence of that experience, that anubhava. So if that experience, so how these, kings and ancient wisdom, how it emanated and how it can be applied today is very relevant because of this connection. And of course, look, I think the argument that somehow everything from the past is sacrosanct is not what I'm making. What I'm trying to say is that there are indeed things that are not applicable today compared to the past. In some cases, not even relevant. So we take those things out. But there are certain, eternal sort of principles and ideas which humans who make decisions in economics in terms of their choices are subject to. And what these principles or ideas and how they can apply it today, given the extension of this dharmic way of life, is a very important question that policymakers need to have. So I think my third book also makes an attempt to sort of take this research forward, and that would give you a much wider perspective of how some of these ideas can be applied today. And I talk about things like dharmic nudges, the role of temple-based economies, and how in some of their policies where the policy, the way of life, the policy is aligned to the way of life rather than the other way around. So these are some ideas that I bring about in my next book. But in conclusion, I would like to say this. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of research, a lot of pending research in a lot of these ancient subjects, especially in the field of economic history. And I think one, as a group, one needs to, indulge more in this. And two, there's a lot of relevance for this today. Our view as we progress towards Viksit Bharat, the ideas that Bharat emanates and shares with the rest of the world become center stage, and people take you far more seriously, which means we need to sort of get a perspective of our indigenous past. And most of the countries who aspire to be a superpower, whether it's the United States, whether it's modern day capitalism, which is inspired by the Protestant ethic, or the Chinese, for example, who have their own ancient wisdom, the same with the Japanese. Even the Japanese Ministry of Finance as a subunit on economic history. So all of them have inspired from their past to provide solutions to the world. I think it's high time, Bharatiya has also sort of make a rigorous case. I could, for example, do all these books in a matter of 5-10 op-eds and get it done with, right? But that's not really the point. The fact that I spent, say, almost a decade in some cases, 7-8 years or more, is because you want a rigorous, evidence-based, scientific analysis of these subjects in a very serious manner, professional manner, so that it reaches to people who are not sympathetic or who don't understand some of these causes. So because the more and more the distraction, eventually these things are once we give more and more of these ideas emanate, though the change might be marginal, eventually there'll be transformation. So with this, I would sort of wrap up my talk. I'd be glad to address questions or anything that you might have.
Thank you so much, Sriramji. Now the platform is open for questions if anyone wants to ask.
I think we can start
Yes.
with Vivek Negiji.
Yes. Vivek Negiji, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Namaste, everyone. Namaste, Sriramji. So my question is around the current global neoliberal capitalist economic system, the ideal one, which we all follow in some hybrid. So while connecting, often I think that and the current movements globally, for example, degrowth in Europe, steady states economics in US, and so on. So for like this, what can Dharmanomics and Dharma-based economy, this system, how can we, where do we begin to start thinking about it, like how it's going in different parts of the world, what India has to contribute in this arena, given the context that it's pretty much understood that how this system works, economic system works at the moment, which is perpetual economic growth idea, and which taking infinite resources and so on, which we are clearly not possible given the state. We can't even think of the degrowth at the moment. So how do we even start to digest all of these thoughts and within the framework of dharma? Thank you.
Okay. So look, I think the approach should be not what this is how I would approach it, right? One of the reasons why I bring about some of these books, and also the next one, is to provide a framework-based analytical case, which I think is very important. Because eventually, whether it is here or the United States or Europe or whatever it is, policymakers and bureaucrats make decisions in terms of policies. So these ideas need to emanate into these frameworks that policymakers can decide and use some of these ideas, right? The primary goal here is to first understand the role of dharma in the sense, often the the entire economic structure is viewed through the prism of both the state and the market. We talk about the state, which regulates, which gives incentives, which pumps in money for infrastructure, and then we have the market, which enables people to compete in the marketplace, and also for the firms to compete and grow and give employment, things like that. The role of dharma is beyond this binary, is foundational to this binary. That's what Kautilya argues. That's why a lot of us also had in mind, where, for example, if there's corruption in the state, a more dharmic society leads you to have a reduction in propensity to be corrupt. Similarly, when in the market, if there is a moral hazard, if there is a big firm really out-competing a smaller firm and not providing the neutral platform, then again, the role of dharma plays an important role to avoid moral hazard. What I'm trying to say is it reduces the responsibility or it reduces stress on the state and the market and plays a role to ease this through the base of dharma. So similarly, in the modern context, if you really look at most of the issues that we're talking about, sustainability, climate change, inclusive growth, reducing inequality, a lot of these ideas have all been addressed in the past through the dharmic model. So what I'm trying to say is, if the problems of both Bṛhat and the rest of the world can find solutions from some of these ideas, then I think that's itself a good proposition to sort of pitch. And as Bṛhat becomes a superpower, this would gain a lot more traction because you are identifying these ideas with a society which is thriving, prosperous, getting back to its, say, global self. So I think that, the thinking should not be how this will apply to all these places. Of course, that's an important thought process. But eventually circumstances and context will change. And as an entity becomes a more powerful political sort of country, its ideas take resonance. So I think that possibility is also there. And I also feel that a lot of the modern day challenges can be addressed through some of these solutions. And lastly, look, even in my next book, I'm not advocating for a wholesale change. What I'm saying is, look, there was this past that we had for thousands of years. There is this framework which defined this. There are various iterations of this framework, and there are various first principles based on this framework. Now, how can we use some of these elements which are relevant today and use some of these principles to accelerate policy, given that our way of life is aligned to this? So in the context of Bṛhat, I think it's very clear. I think I'm very confident that sort of a dharma-based economic framework is a very important contribution to its economic prosperity. But in the context of say global issues, of course, the way of life really differs from the rest of the country. So I think what the approach should be looking at some of the major problems of the world and how some of these ideas can provide solutions. So again, it would be, like I mentioned, it would be marginal changes into a system which is already entrenched. And then eventually, when there is more traction, some of these things will gain, will gain traction and then eventually lead to transformation. That's the hope. But I think one should start with Bṛhat first, defining what we are, providing this perspective, correlating to the present, providing, again, ideas and thoughts in that direction, and then looking at dealing with some of the broader issues that the world has, for which there are solutions here as well.
We have another question from Sunilji. Please go ahead.
Namaskar, everyone. Namaskar, Sriramji. See, while this change and the transformation that we are looking in the economic side, what I thought is the framework that which is a building block and the foundation that needs to be laid, it has to come from the education sector. And I mean, if you see the policies and the direction which is all given is from our textbooks and the universities, right? So is it not imperative to actually start this journey from the education sector. I just want to know your view on this.
100%. There's no doubt about this. I mean, but education again is a very, it's a long-term process, right? In the sense, of course, there need to be fundamental changes. I think the IKS initiative is a very important initiative, highly underrated, but in my view, is having a profound impact, especially among higher education institutions in this country. I mean, I've been doing this for about 8-9 years, especially post the NEP, the plethora of IKS institutes across this country. I think it's really shaping up well in terms of producing concrete research. Of course, at the school level as well, a lot of this needs to be done and changed. But in some cases, see, it is also a multi-pronged, it's sort of a multi-pronged attack, right? In the sense that multi-pronged approach, because if you're looking at just education alone, that I think is one part of the solution. A major part of the solution is when key decision makers start embracing such concepts and add credibility to it. And that's what some of my research tries to do. For example, if you look at the blurbs for my book, they are from mainstream policymakers. I mean, they're all experienced veterans who have been in economic policy and economic decision making, right? And why I think economics is important is, I mean, let's think about it, right? What is the single most transformative event in the last 40 years in Bṛhat? I would say on the top of the list, probably one or two is the economic reforms of 1990 in terms of day-to-day transformation of how we approach our lives, right? Whether we like it or not, economics is a profound impact of how society functions and how society responds to a lot of these issues. So I think it's very important to leverage that in a more positive sense, to use its transformative impact. Because see, the stakeholders who need to be convinced are not people in this, in this Zoom discussion, for example, right? Most of these people who are part of Bṛhat, who are part of IKS, are all people who are sort of aligned to this in some form or the other. The question really is how the common person who's willing to sort of engage and think about it openly is going to be convinced by some of these ideas. And I think the more and more that is done, the more and more there will be traction. Like International Yoga Day, right? For example, 10 years back, yoga in the West, especially in a lot of these policy institutions, was a non-event. So today, when you really look, not just in India, in Bharat, but across the world, during International Yoga Day, everyone is there with a yoga mat, doing yoga. So I think that's a very good example of a particular idea whose time has come, who's backed by a strong leader with a strong institute, with a country which is aspiring to be a superpower, and most importantly, it addresses a lot of the problems that the West has. So it's gaining traction. So what I'm trying to say is, it's while education indeed is very important, I completely agree with you, but I think it has to be a multidimensional approach. You have to do multiple things at the same time to take these ideas forward.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
have another question. Bhaskari ji, please go ahead. Not audible.
Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right. Pranam, thank you for the session. It was really opening up a lot of my rusted brain areas. Sir, I had a question regarding the diplomatic power that comes with a sound economic practice. Like you gave the particular example of the Vijayanagar Samrajya, where people would, what we say, or temple administration. Forgive me if I'm not using the right terms and don't have economics background. And that would also benefit social endeavors. Or they would lend money, along with the temple work, it would also help social undertakings. Now, in that sense, Vijayanagara Samrajya, I had read earlier, was also a very good example of diplomatic administration. Is somewhere their economic vigor related to their diplomatic strength as well? Because amongst all these Samrajyas that I did, I had this hobby of reading up on lipis, Kharoshti or Tiglari on all of that. So in one of them, I had to backread on Vijayanagara Samrajya, and they had written a comparative analysis of diplomatic power of different dynasties. And in that, they have mentioned that Vijayanagara Samrajya was a unique Samrajya in the sense it had not engaged in any warfare, and most of their strength lied in diplomatic powers with all their neighboring countries. And they had very sound economic rigor as well. Now, that kind of rang a bell when you mentioned about their economic setup. So somewhere, is it related? Diplomatic power and economic rigor, is there related? And that is my first question. Somewhere I feel it is very strongly related. And the second question is, in the current times, like you already mentioned in your talk, our ancients, Vyaparis, they had a very dharmic definition of how to conduct business administration. And people in business administration or śreṇis had the capacity to talk over the political administration or the Rajyadhikaris. Okay. That kind of happens even now, but the circle of it is even more strong because they are not just, please go, Amritesh. I'm sorry, my son is troubling me. Please go. So that circle is kind of even more stronger because right now, I don't know how dharmic our business administrations are. So their say might have more power because in the sense, when we had the idea of reducing imports from China or reducing, certain resources from China, the main stop for that was from the Ambanis. This was from a talk that I had attended earlier from Mr. Monte Carlo Villa. How he mentioned it was China provided more stable and affordable labor. Please go. Affordable labor compared to any other region within India. And within India, that temporal aspect was not respected. So in that sense, the Amanis did not want to engage with, jeopardizing their ties with China. So that was not taken forward. So in the current state, if the business administration is not defined by dharmic perspective, and if that is tied with diplomacy, if we as policy writers are moving with a dharmic perspective of everything, how should we go ahead in current times? This is my question. I'm sorry, I'm not able to put it very succinctly because I'm nervous in economics completely.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll just, segue my answer into two broad questions. One is diplomacy and economics. And two is the role of, say, corporates in today's Bṛhat and their sort of dharmic tendencies or approaches. Okay? So on the first question, look, the thing with diplomacy and economics is a chicken and egg story, right? Unless you're politically strong, your political strength provides a base for economic prosperity, right? You can be a very politically strong entity, meaning stable, strong entity, and that provides a very good base for continuous economic prosperity, right? But once you become economically more and more prosperous, your political strength also subsequently rises. And then you leverage a lot on the economics of it. So it's both ways, right? So in the case of, in Vijayanagar and all these kingdoms, right? All the common era kingdoms, they had extensive connections with the rest of the countries. For example, there are evidences of Chinese embassy notes that the Cholas sent to China, to their kings, emissaries, which are written by both anecdotal as well as inscriptive evidence. So, for example, there was this Greek diplomat who was also Megasthenes, who was also writing a lot of things which happened when he was here. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of these kingdoms very strong diplomatic connections, right? And that's what I mean by engaging with the rest of the world, right? This land was never close to the rest of the world, except for post-independent India till 1991. We were told that somehow in 1991 we became, open to the rest of the world, right? Which is far from the truth. If you really look at our past, I mean, if you make an honest assessment of our past, most of our socio-political, economic, not just the rulers, right? I mean, we're talking about diplomacy in terms of rulers and economics in terms of policymakers. I'm talking about common people. A 7th century Pallava king, Nandivarman II, who built the Kanchipuram Varadaraj Swami temple, was actually one of the theories is that he's born in Champa in Vietnam. So we are able to even get someone who's born abroad to be a ruler here, and he becomes one of the most prosperous kings. So what I'm trying to say is this entire notion of us somehow being a closed society is as flawed as anything else. So what I'm trying to say is the idea of diplomacy, the idea of engaging with other states, other entities, was a very intrinsic concept in all these kingdoms. So that's a sort of a given. On the role that the changes which some of these kingdoms had were also because of the geography of them. So I'll give you an example, right? Say if you take the Cholas and Pandyas, they're in the same state. I mean, today's Tamil Nadu. But the Cholas were more on the coastal side, right? They had a lot of these ports like Nagapattinam and all these places, which are transient ports, which means something similar to, say, Singapore, for example, today, right? Where a lot of the goods go via Singapore, but Singapore doesn't per se trade much because it's a very small place, right? So similarly, a lot of the Cholas use some of their ports as transient ports for trade between Middle East and China through Bharat and the rest of Asia, right? Whereas the Pandyas were a bit different because the Pandyas are far more inland. And they had a lot of their trade and ports which were trading products made in the inland in Bharat. So less of a transient port, but more of an inland sort of, a product-driven port. So what I'm trying to say is there are a lot of distinctions like this, right? So similarly, what you say is Vijayanagar could have had a policy of strength, because of their diplomatic maneuverings, they're able to, navigate a lot of these wars and things like that. That is definitely an important sort of, concept. So economics and diplomacy, I think it's a sort of a chicken and egg story. It works both ways, and one helps the other as it, progresses. On the second question of, dharmic principles of, say, businesses. Look, this research doesn't argue for someone to be more dharmic necessarily. What this research says is, look, there is already a dharmic society. Okay? There is a dharmic way of life happening right now in all our lives. Just don't be blind to it is what I'm saying, right? What I'm trying to say is that way of life is defining a lot of the economic activity that is happening, right? So one needs to be cognizant of it, aware of it, and then align it to the way of life. Because this way of life is very difficult for someone sitting in Delhi or someone sitting, for ruling for 30 years to change. Because this is there for thousands of years. Irrespective of what happens, say on the external circumstances, you would still continue this way of life. So what I'm trying to say is, so from a policy perspective, I'm trying to say that, look, there's already an ecosystem which is happening. You be aware of this ecosystem, nudge your policy in a way which is aligned to this ecosystem, then it makes whatever you want far more effective. So I'll give you an example, right? So if you take the entire Swachh Bharat initiative, that's one example which I often cite, where the entire cleanliness paradigm, just like Saucham, what we discuss as cleanliness within our own houses, which we are all very clean, through the Prime Minister and the scheme and the focus on, Swachhata, focus on Saucham, focus on cleanliness, we've basically taken it out, especially in rural areas, taken it out from the house to the neighborhood. So much so that if I go to, say, a small village in Tamil Nadu today, except for the main bazaar street, most of the other streets are fairly clean. There might be Swachhata, outlets there, but what I'm trying to say is most of the people have taken it to their way of life, where they've expanded this, to their neighborhood, and somehow being clean now is become a dharmic need for them. So this is an example of how the way of life, a policy comes to way of life, makes effectiveness far higher, so that it's almost an autopilot now, right? Rather than some guy sitting in Delhi telling you what to do, and it's completely against your way of life. So answering a question on what the individual firms do, individual dharmic values and systems for entities, for individuals and corporations, they're a different story. Everyone has their version of dharma, right? But my prism is through the role of the state and how the state views, and in the broader context of the state, what are some of the ideas that they can emanate? So I think there's a slight difference there. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I think I need to recheck the perspective. Okay. Good. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yes, Shubhamji, please go ahead.
Yeah. Jai Shriram ji. Thanks for the beautiful insights. I would definitely looking forward to read more about your work. Shriram ji, first question that as you mentioned that you observe many things and you bring it forward, temple-based economy and dharma-based economic framework. You mentioned that coastline of Bharat, major temples of India, Bharat were located in coastlines. So my only simple question is that during this research, did you find anything which are relics of our ancient past or ancient dharmic model which are still present? So if you could mention few of your observations, then please.
Of course, I mean, if you look at the major temples and say even the Bṛhadeshwara temple, right, in Tanjavur, it is built around, I would say 10th century, 1010 to be precise. That's when it's completed. CE. It's still has withstood so many earthquakes. It is still standing strong. Its irrigation system is still very good. Its entire sort of resilience in terms of not just withstanding all these earthquakes and all these things, in terms of staying on par with the latest technology. For example, let's take a challenge, right? We have all the leading architects of the world, right? If I want to throw a genuine challenge for someone to replicate one-to-one this entire, for example, the Bṛhadeshwara temple itself. I still think it will be a challenge. I mean, people, of course, can still do it, but with all the nuances, the engineering nuances of this temple, for example, the shadow, at no point can you see a shadow of the temple when it's designed in such a way. And there's a Mahakum sort of at the top, which is, which is very heavy, which has been transported to the top, for example. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of these, especially the architecture of these temples, and they're all there for us to see. But in terms of systems, I think one of them I mentioned is that even this idea of some of the barter trade systems, right? Like how we trade, how we hedge risk. Some of the ideas still percolate today. I mentioned that in a book as well, in some areas. But I think how we should approach these systems is not look at the systems, right? Looking at the systems is a good thing because the systems are developed in that context. But what is the principle behind the system? Because principles is again something that you can apply across board. It's a horizontal, right? So it's something that you can use some of these principles in the context of today, right? So for example, trade was rampant in ancient times, no doubt about this. But that the timing and the technology was still limited, right? I mean, today we know instantly when goods go from one place to another. We know we have technology to really back us up. So those are contextual changes, but the principles of trade remain the same. The role of the state, for example, still is the state. The role of the society is still the society. And you and me, for example, might buy a laptop today. 1,000 years back, we might have bought a boat. But eventually we are buying a product, right? We are buying a particular product. And when you're buying that particular product, you have a set of factors you take into account while buying the product, right? So those principles still remain. So I think there are examples of some of these systems, especially irrigation systems that are quite visible even today. But I would rather look at principles, how some of the principles behind these systems can be used today.
I have one small question also, which can have very open-ended answer from you. As we see that you have mentioned discretionary expenditure, which depends upon customs and narratives, cultural norms. So as you mentioned also that in 2001 Nobel Economics, the person who got in economics, he has mentioned, and so much research has been done. So I'm very curious always when I see such things between East and West, then what are the working model or in principles or in mindset or in work ethics, we are different. Because whenever we give them a piece of paper, the observation from East and West will be totally different. We have given them yoga, but they have not taken it as it is. They have done their own research and they are just repackaging it. So what is that principle which you have observed during your research? If you want to specify in economic framework where we are different, so what is that difference and what makes that different? So in terms of working model, how we are different? Why they go deep in research whenever they counter anything new, and they have very long-term vision, but we lack in some few of these things. So what is making that difference?
That's a very deep question, but I'll try to be, as brief as possible. So the first thing is that, right, you need to understand that the Western civilization, especially the Anglo-Saxon world, is at best 300 to 400 years old. Okay. So, I mean, civilized world, right? I'm not talking about Europe. I'm talking about, the West as in the Anglo-Saxon West. So, which means that their understanding, experience of the world, systems, people, processes, is still a work in progress, right? It is still something that they are coming to terms with, right? In the sense that they are still exploring, and their ambit of exploration is science, right? Our ambit of exploration, we have both a liability as well as an asset. In my view, it's an asset. An asset because we have a civilization which is spanning thousands of years, which means multiple changes in society, people, states, and state, and all these things. But yet we have ideas which have survived all this, right? On the other hand, because of invasions and because of all this constant assault on our knowledge systems, we have sort of left our roots, right? And I'll give you an example, right? I mean, most of our Hindu scriptures are all in Sanskrit, right? And in our local languages, of course, but majority of it is in Sanskrit. Okay, not even 1% of the population knows Sanskrit today. Okay, so which means we have evolved. A lot of our forefathers, for example, have had their entire lives not knowing Sanskrit, and gone through saying that their Hindu way of life and gone through their entire life without knowing the core language which defines that way of life. Like, so what I'm trying to say is that, right, we have been sort of, but of course, that also is an intrinsic strength of our civilization, that despite a lot of our obstacles, the anubhava, the experience, overrides all these things: language, creed, caste, color, creed. So what I'm trying to say is we've had a lot of handicaps because of a lot of these, issues. And I think that's why understanding the past is very important, because, see, it provides an identity, right? It provides an inherent strength to people that you come from an illustrious past. That's very important. It's a very subtle but very, very important, thing to establish, because it provides a lot of confidence for the civilization, for the entities in the civilization to address the questions of the future. Because the reason why is, for example, we take a lot of the ideas in the United States today as say, the norm for the last 50, 60 years or 100 years, is because they are the most prosperous country in the world. So what I'm trying to say is prosperity. That's why Kautilya's Arthashastra is a very good example. There's a reason why Kautilya did Arthashastra for political dominance, because he was very much aware that economic prosperity is the base for political dominance. So what I'm trying to say is the Western approach to things is different because they don't have any sort of background, any sort of, sort of with a clean slate, put it that way. So, whereas in our case, we have both as an asset as a liability. And secondly, we shouldn't, be too obsessed with what the West thinks, because eventually I think we should be firm on what we are and what our ideas are. And if these ideas provide solutions to the West and the rest of the world, great. But we shouldn't, in my view, we should first explore what our ideas are.
We have one question in the chat box from Pinerji. I'll just quickly read it out. Namaste Sriramji, you mentioned the role of temples as financial institutions in the past. Looking at temple freedom movement, do you think our temples, if freed from government control, could go back to being financial institutions? If yes, what kind of regulations from a secular India government would they have to operate under?
Yeah, I'm not, advocating for this in the sense it's a good question. What I am saying is there are two things in this debate. Of course, if given a choice, I would definitely want the temples freed from the control of the state. But that's primarily a political issue now, right? So politicians and and stakeholders in the system need to find a solution, right? But what I'm trying to say is there is an ecosystem created because of the temple as an institution, right? So, for example, right, let's say Tamil Nadu has approximately 15,000 temples, probably much more, but I'm just giving a broad figure. And say approximately the revenue is about 20,000 crores, okay? But the revenue of all this is basically on the receipts of the temple, by and large. Right? What the temple, does in terms of once you go to the temple for darshan and all that the temple does inside the temple. But there's an economy created because the temple is a functioning temple around the temple, which means the shops, the tourism, the hospitality sector, the entire service sector boom in that particular area, whether it's a aviation in terms of an airport nearby, and in terms of, say, any other sort of entity, commercial entity nearby, because of the temple as an economic institution, that is an ecosystem which is away from the political space. In the sense that it's not as contentious. So that's an area which we can liberate right away. Build economies of scale around that ecosystem. So I would I'm not answering a question directly, like a politician, but I'm trying to trying to move the debate from this, because the temple is a financial institution. I don't think, it can work in today's setup because of the fact that we already have financial institutions in place. So it'll be practically difficult for us to, I would say, do that. But in a decentralized structure, I think the temple plays a very important role, because if you really want the decentralized panchayat model, which is, I think, the decentralized approach to economic governance, the temple plays a very important role as an economic institution. So the ecosystem around the temple can be liberated. That'll be great. So this would be probably my answer.
I hope, Vinayji, that answers your question. We have one more from Ms. Shruti Jain. She has two questions. One is, how can the timeless principles of Kautilya's Rajmandala guide model states in managing adversarial relations to safeguard interests while avoiding unwarranted escalations?
Yeah, so I've read both the questions, so I'll try to answer them. The first one, yeah, I think definitely there is a book on this you can write on Kautilya's Rajmandala theory in this application. I think, again, an example of how to do this is the insolvency and bankruptcy code, which a lot of you, I mean, it is not a diplomatic entity, but it's an economic entity, which was created in 2016 by this government, the IBC, where basically when a company goes bankrupt, you go and, file for bankruptcy and then get your company sold and revive that company as an entity. So Kautilya's principles of Samadhana Bandhabhed is something that I advocate in my previous book, and argue that the IBC itself sort of follows this implicitly in dealing with some of these things. So I think definitely there is a case for showcasing this Rajmandala theory. But it's a very interesting research topic, right? If you're a researcher, I think you should explore this. The question really is, how do you draw a framework for this so that people can use it? So at the moment, policymakers, I think, will use it implicitly, which means they would have read about it somewhere and then intuitively they would have, advocated these policies in managing relationships. The question is, how do you draw a framework for this? So that I think I'll throw it back to you. I think that's a good research idea, which, you guys can explore. Second, on your dharmic alternative, yeah, it's a very important topic. I'm writing a paper, which I will share with Raghav probably soon, on how dharma and SDG goals are aligned to each other. In fact, the SDGs are a derivative of dharma, is what I argue in that paper. So that is, that's also something similar to this is definitely possible. I think not as an alternative to BRI, but how do you use such principles for conceptualizing a similar thing to a BRI, right? Which is an initiative where you contribute to the rest of the world, where you basically provide finance to the rest of the world. And how do you create a structure based on dharmic principles? I think that's a very interesting idea. So it's very much possible, yes.
One more question in the chat box from Arunji. In the era of LPG, where India is the crony capitalist country and all the economics were influenced by the other countries, how come we can incorporate the Dharmanomics?
Okay. In the India of, can you repeat the first part of the question?
In the era of LPG, where India is the crony capitalist country and all the economics were influenced by other countries, how can we incorporate Dharmanomics? Is his question.
Okay, so from my understanding of the question, let me try to answer. So we live in a globalized world, no doubt, which means we are influenced by a lot of these countries on how we live and all these things. But there is also a very important, Bharatiya economic structure, which drives also the economy. The inherent consumer demand that we have and the large population, which is part of this demand. So I think in that sense, we can, in a globalized world, we can still retain certain strengths, certain customization to our own, ideas and push these ideas forward. And the entire idea of cronyism is also countered by Kautilya when he talks about the idea of avoiding Matsya Nyaya. So how do you avoid Matsya Nyaya? So one of the principles that Kautilya says is rule of law and implementation of rule of law. Make it very strict so that people fearfully, in some cases, but people stick to rule of law, and that will ensure that Matsya and cronyism is avoided. So I think there are principles which we can use. And I don't think we should be, we should give excuses to ourselves somehow that, the rest of the world we are subject to the rest of the world, so we don't do anything about ourselves.
I hope, Arunji, that answers your question. Any other questions?
Can I have a little bit of clarification, one small clarification? When we speak, this is a very, I don't know how to categorize my question myself. Okay. So since you're speaking about dharma and economics, and you just now spoke about law enforcement and how strict it has to be, and certain other points from our previous classes. So it brings me to the thought process that will be there will be for the practitioner of such principles, if we desire to tread on this path, we need some basic qualities in ourselves. And forbearance or the capacity to endure would be probably the first. If we go by that principles, then the Shat Sampati and the Arishad Vargas will probably come into fore. It's probably a fight between these two. And Arthashastra is probably right in middle and helping us to go, practice our Shat Sampatis against the Shat Vargas. So the more we practice our Shat Sampatis, which is Sama, Dhamma, Titikshna, and Uparatya, etc., etc. So when you see the general status of a society now, which is more on indulgence, more on consumption. I don't want to bear anything. I have had enough of endurance. I have faced enough of tribulations. Now it's my time to have a good time. In general, when I look around, there are very few people that have that sense of responsibility and accountability versus a sense of entitlement and consumption. For a society like this, when you speak about dharma and economics and law enforcement, I'm probably seeing a problem at the execution phase, where even at public policy level, we may think and put down certain policies having something good in mind. We'll probably have unintended consequences because at execution level personnel don't have those qualities, or it's still dormant in them at the current times. And as you said, educational system is a long-term goal. What can I or we as a public policy personnel do to circumvent these ideological issues towards the success of our goals? If keeping dharma in mind, keeping economics in mind. I think this is how I should voice my question. For the current generation, in the future, things will be better, because I see, and this Sabha itself, for example, is an example that, okay, the times are getting better probably, but for now, right now, there has to be a change for a dominoes effect, for a later time where there are more people being this way is a norm. Right now, it's not the norm. What can we do as policymakers to ensure that people have, or at least invoke their Shat Sampatis, and have that kind of decision making, and towards nation building, towards building the self and the nation? What can we do towards that?
Yeah. So from what you mentioned, I think there are two things which come to my mind. So the first thing is, I think this word of dharma and our personal sort of attachment to dharma is makes us in general subjective to what we see as what dharmic is. And it's your expectation of what a dharmic person should be, right? Or you or my or
In
individual
general,
expectation.
in general. Okay, yeah.
So that is an individual construct. So
Mhm.
from the role of a state, I think the role of a state is not to necessarily enhance your personal dharmic values per se in a direct way. The role of a state is to acknowledge that there is a dharmic way of life that is happening. The role of
Correct,
state
correct.
in view of a policymaker is to reflect what is happening, right? Okay, if you're intending to as a state policy, you're intending to have a more dharmic society, that's a different story altogether, right? I'm talking about for a public policy professional, the goal is to reflect what society is happening, what is happening in the society, and then you have some policy goals and outcomes that you have. And you characterize them in a way which is aligned to this this way of life that is
Okay. I'm not able to hear you properly. I'll turn off my video.
that is the primary sort of, instead of, it's all, in my view, a side story to what we are talking about here, or what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is something very narrow. There is a way of life which is happening. You understand the way of life, try to understand the way of life, and you have certain policies and outcomes. You design such policies and outcomes which is aligned to this way of life so that your policy outcomes become more effective, right?
Okay.
So
So then let me put it this way. Can I have an example of it? Because when you say I'm able to relate to it, but in my circumstance where my policy is targeted, I'm not able to visualize it. Can you give like examples? Like you gave an example of law enforcement. If the law enforcer is compromised, it is never going to be enforced. So wherever, even if it's in healthcare, now if I'm giving subsidized, say the Vajpayee scheme that came in Kidwai Cancer Hospital for low income patients, it actually gets deflected to low caste employees in that place. And I have tried to address that issue, but it becomes a huge problem. And I'm like trying to figure out where this policy is failing.
sorry, I got cut off.
Right. So with this, we'll close the session, sir, then.
Sure. Thank you again for the opportunity. I think if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And then, of course, if you're on LinkedIn or you want to review the book, please go ahead. Would love you guys to review the book in Amazon or mention about the event in LinkedIn. It'll be great so that we can engage on the topic.
Yes. With that, we come to an end for this session. Thank you so much, Sriramji, for this wonderful, insightful session. I myself, being a student of temple architecture, I understand how this is a multidimensional approach, like you mentioned. We have to understand the administration, economics, everything, not just architecture. And it was really insightful. Thank you for the session. Thank you to all our audience for joining. I would also like to thank Dr. Bhuvan Raghavan, sir, who couldn't be here, and of course, Department of Heritage Science and Technology and IIT Hyderabad for all their support to host this event. And thank you everyone once again for joining. I think after this session, all of you would like to definitely buy the book. So I am pasting the link in the chat box and you can purchase the book from the Amazon link. And I would like to end this session with the Shanti mantra. So I would request everyone to join their hands and close their eyes. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. Once again, thank you so much everyone for joining. With this, we'll close the session and I'm sending the link in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.